My first memory of my life, looking back on it now, might in a sense very well have been my last memory. I was 1 or 2, barely beyond a toddler, in India, the last child of 4 born to missionary parents. We were living in Allahabad at the time, in north central India. At the beginning of this memory, looking at it from this distance, I see the world outside a car. It's a black car, a long black car that's sitting out in the sunlight, and I'm the only one inside the car. I'm in the front seat, looking out and feeling the heat gather around me. It's getting hotter and hotter, and I start to feel uncomfortable and very lonesome, wondering where everybody has gone. And why am I alone in the car? I'm never alone in the car. Well, this memory would have dated from 1950, 51, somewhere in there. We were in Allahabad. I was in the car. The car was in this rather rounded driveway in front of the building called Bungalow Number 1. It was the number 1 residence for the Agricultural Institute of Allahabad, of which my father, Art Mosier, was the principal in those days. Dr. Arthur T. Mosier. Maybe Dad was responsible for me being in the car by myself. Maybe my mother was. She was very forgetful in those days, very preoccupied with her own misery. She had been in deep despair ever since the year or so following my birth, maybe because of my birth. I wasn't wondering about that when I was in the front seat of that black car, feeling hotter and hotter by the moment. I started to scream to get some attention. I was probably very flushed and pink by this time. I stood on the front seat, I remember, and I reached up around the top of the back of the front seat. I pulled myself up somehow onto the top of the seat, and I tumbled down into the footwell of the rear seat. But that didn't help. It only hurt and contributed to my feeling more helpless and alone. I screamed louder. That's all I remember. My first memory of life. At that point, someone must have come and released me from that car. Someone must have heard me screaming from inside the house, or suddenly remembered, where is Dickie? And gone out to look for me and seen me jumping around and shrieking within this black car. Black, which attracts heat. And it was sitting out in the bright sunlight on this horseshoe-shaped driveway. Years and years later, when I described this first memory to other members of my family, I must have been at that point 8 or 9 or 10 years old, but I was very sure of that first memory. My brothers, 10 and 12 years older, Ted and Bill, were skeptical about this scene. They said, "Now, Dickie," because they still called me Dickie even when I was 8 and 9. "This couldn't have happened like that. No one would have neglected you. No one would have left you behind in the car." I said, "What would you have known? You would have been up in the hills in boarding school." I'd always been jealous of them going to this wonderful boarding school, Woodstock, that they would talk about years and years later. They talked about it very fondly, rhapsodically, and I had missed out on it. I had missed out on that. I had missed out on the houseboat trips in Kashmir, on these great lakes where they'd floated around in houseboats and they had seen Jawaharlal Nehru ride past on a white stallion. I'd missed all of that. I'd missed the treks in the hills that Dad took them on, and where he would fry potatoes over the campfire and flip the potatoes up in the air and catch them in the frying pan. Those were things I only heard about. The romantic stories of their Indian youth that I had never shared because I had only been 3 years old when we had all come back to the States. So Bill and Ted looked at me dubiously. Ted, who was always the more skeptical, said, "If you're so sure of this memory, then tell me this. The car was sitting in the driveway, right?" And I said, "That's right." "Well then, describe to me what shape was the driveway." And I said, "That's easy. It was kind of a horseshoe shape. And there was a tree in the middle." He said, "Yeah, that's right. You must have seen a picture of it somewhere." I said, "I never saw a picture of it. I saw the driveway itself in my terror as I looked out the windows of this car. And no one was there to get me out. You weren't there. You find me a picture of that driveway that I might have seen when I was 5 or 6 or 7 years old to give me this, what you're calling a false memory. Find that picture and show me." He said, "All right, I will." But he never did. As far as I know, there was no picture of that driveway, except burned in my memory. When my parents and I went back to India briefly, I was 11 years old in 1960. It was a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Agricultural Institute in Allahabad. I took a picture of bungalow number 1, but I didn't take a photo of the driveway. I didn't need to remind myself the shape of that driveway. I remembered.